Now moving on to a topic, kind of we've been touching on it all afternoon, but a broader scope at the look of defense. Our next speaker, Major Sean McClain, is a thought leader on space power theory and an expert on cis-lunar space situational awareness. Major McClain is an experienced space operations officer in the orbital warfare discipline with over 13 years of Air Force service. He has an MBA from AMU and a Master's of Science from the USAF Air Command and Staff College. His recent work on creating a framework for cis-lunar space domain awareness in 2035 is the type of long-term thinking and advocacy that perfectly represents what this conference is all about. Everyone, please welcome Major Sean McClain.
Am I live?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to start sharing screen. Where am I? So I admit when I got the call to support this one, I just figured I'd do the same slides again, but as I was hearing stuff develop, it sounded like I needed to be a bit more prepared and on my A game. So I think this kind of meets the intent. And as I was listening, I didn't attempt to copy anyone's thought, but it definitely sounds like the last four speakers before me think exactly like me. So if I sound like I'm repeating any of it, it's not intentional. I was building my own deck while listening, but I'm building the deck based off of my paper and my own thoughts. So I do think that what you're going to hear is going to be along the same lines, but I'll try to convey it hopefully in a slightly different context, and hopefully it won't be exactly the same thing. Hopefully you'll hear it slightly differently. So again, here's my quick disclaimer. Most of this stuff will be coming from my paper, Celestial Sentinels, my ACSC thesis paper, and then anything else will be, again, my own thoughts, not necessarily representing the views of DoD. So mostly what I've been starting with, mostly what I'm known for, I guess, in these kinds of events are the cis-lunar space domain awareness framework, and then the proposed architecture for circa 2035. So we'll just kind of briefly walk through what some of these graphics are. And now I just kind of added some bumpers just to kind of give a little more of a kind of a classroom brief walkthrough. This is what it is if you didn't want to read the whole paper. So what I essentially do is I break it out into sections, the thesis out into 4 main sections, spending a lot of time just going over essentially what are the main layers, what are the main pieces of what a military person needs to know or understand in 2035 about my proposed operational area of cis-lunar space. And so I start with the physical layer. Here's what's out there right now. You don't really need anything special. You just need to have, a few textbooks, and you can quickly figure out this is what's out there. This is what it looks like. This is generally what we have. If we don't do anything with it, this is what it's going to be. And then we start building on that to eventually say, what is the art of the possible by 2035? And I use the legend to the left to just kind of describe these little graphics and icons about what's available in each orbit. I think generally, I don't give numbers to it. I just say this is generally how each of the orbits, the points, the Lagrange points can be used based on their orbital characteristics. And that's essentially all this graphic was meant to convey, combining physical layer with economic layer. So that's just getting into chapter 1 and chapter 2. So then I go into some case studies basically to start articulating, okay, we've got an idea of the economic, but let's do a scenario. Let's say we have a search and rescue mission, and if there is no specific United States Space Coast Guard, and it's all under Space Force, right? And there's no auxiliaries anywhere, and it's all under one service basically. It's going to be on the Space Force, I think, to essentially figure out what a planning to execution to recovery of, in this case, a downed or a in distress SpaceX Starship out in one of these orbits. They need help. What are we going to do about it? How do you even start planning for such a thing? How do you execute such a thing? What do you need to execute such a thing? And you need SDA. You need a basic sense of what's going on in your environment. You need a basic sense of C2 to be able to execute, command and control, do all that. And then you need some capability. So, from bottom to the top, you need a basic sense of what's going on. You need some kind of platform to go do it. And then you need to execute it and recover all that. So that's kind of how I'm just kind of generally describing this graphic in a little paragraph or two in my paper about what is required notionally, without really getting into specifics about how you think about planning for and preparing for just kind of, if you're doing initial idea on a back sheet of a napkin, how you would write the requirements for cis-lunar search and rescue, right? That's kind of one of the case studies that I use just to start mapping this stuff out. And then after I do that with a couple different other things, I came up with the proposed cis-lunar SDA architecture towards the end of the paper. And that's what this was essentially, without all the other stuff on top of it. This is just the nuts and bolts. Here's what I think we basically need to have at the following locations. Again, no numbers attached, just basic capabilities. And then I finally finished my paper with the cis-lunar operational area OV1 circa 2035. This is what I think and I guess it's the theme of today. This is what a blue water space officer in Space Force in 2035 needs in order to perceive their environment in the way that I would argue a naval officer views their proposed environment. You know, if you're talking in the Pacific Ocean somewhere, they probably have a similar sense of where the trade lanes are, where the major ports of call are, where all the infrastructure are, where the shipyards are, all of that stuff. They just have a sense of where those things are and what they do and what their relationship is to each other. And that's what I'm trying to describe here, all within the green line, the operational area, the AOR. This is what Commander US Space Command is in charge of, according to me. And this is what he needs to be responsible for and take action on. This is his backyard. This is his area. So now I'm going to move into what I think is kind of the idea of where I'm going to try to add some of the defense stuff, the so what. And again, hearing it, not quite intentionally copying anybody. I think at the same time that I was writing this paper, I was trying to figure out, okay, so what does the military need to do about this? And I think essentially what I was thinking about a couple years ago, and it's kind of becoming more at the forefront, you heard it today from several other people. You can have the trade space between brown and blue. You can have that debate now. That's fine. I look at it like a target in the future, right? It is what it is now. It's probably going to be different in the future. Let's figure out what do we think is realistic for being in that future target date, and then what can we do about it to start shifting the culture, the operational focus, and the funding focus to start getting after a certain, a different type of Space Force than the one we have now, with a different focus, different mission sets. So I like to look at it in terms of what are the potential mission sets. I'm happy to send these out later. I don't really want to get into specifics, but the way that I had to do this, just to kind of do a bit of due diligence to myself, is I just had to bin stuff according to what I think makes sense. And I had to do it in a framework where I could be, I think Dr. Zarnik said earlier, I wanted to be honest with myself. And if somebody were to grill me and put me on the spot and say, defend your answer, defend your thesis, I would say, well, I basically tried to be normalized relative to the joint functions and the other services, how they view their functions and similar terms. So I wanted to basically approach Space Force mission sets in a way that the other services did. And I wanted to be normal. I wanted to do it in the same approximate way. So I tried to break it down in a fairly straightforward manner. I tried to bin things that I thought would be approximately things that could exist in the future in a nomenclature of functions and mission areas that would make sense to any of the other services. And we could certainly have a conversation about what's what, but generally just trying to get at where things fit in a pecking order of, you know, this is this, this is this, this is this, and getting into the details about why this matters later. So this is the approach that I used just to kind of normalize what those bins were earlier. So again, you've got the access, direction, cognition, presence, coercion, force, and exploitation on the left. Those are the 7 general functions, and they have their own different tiers, basically, which I'll get into a bit later. This is just, again, Sean McClain's approach, how I thought about just to get to the background about why those graphics were the way they were. This is just how I, as a blue water, self-professed blue water thinker, think about what this Space Force of the future looks like and how they think about their mission sets relative to each other. And this is overlaid with the, on the right, that's the current Space Force SCP service core functions, I think is the term that they use, core competencies. Those are theirs. I came up with my own, but I'm just using theirs just to use the same rationale and approach. And I'm going to do my stuff later, but I just want to show this is where the USSF sits right now, I think, relative to the other services and their proposed functions. And you'll see there's some gaps, which I find interesting. And there's definite overlays, which I also find interesting. But I just think that this is a way to start talking about a conversation, brown versus blue, in a way that I think would kind of help some of these other arguments. Is why is Space Force doing this? Well, this other service does that. Why can't we do that? Or vice versa. You know, why are we doing this when the other services don't do that? Stuff like that. It just helps us have a normal one-for-one conversation. So then I tried to take that and put that on the shelf for a minute. And then I tried to approach it another way. And I said, okay, going forward in the future, we're going to have something that is, again, normal relative to the other domains. How do we think about our domain? And I think as a blue water thinker, you know, let's start with Corbett and Mahan and that notion of command: presence, coercion, force. Those are basically the three things that you use to describe command of a domain. It's all encompassing. It's all whole of government. It's just three big words that say, do you have a general command of the sea? Can you do what you want when you want? And if not, why not? And it's just three basic ways to think about what is going on at a given time between two or more actors in a global commons environment in the middle of the ocean somewhere. Do you have presence, coercion, and force? And if you have more of one and not enough of the other, what does that look like? So overlaying that with range of military operations, I wanted to take a look at another document from Joint Operational Environment 2035, overlay what another author said would be the 4 future main areas of the Air Force, but I think we're generally going to be applicable for the joint environment anyway. And I wanted to overlay a rough Rubik's Cube superiority military parity kind of chart, all to put together this general chart that outlines what command looks like when you start tacking on these 4 different mission areas and the general parity. And I'm trying to get to the point, and hopefully it's already been hammered home before, which is to say that I think brown water has a place, and it does what it does because it always assumes that that middle layer of how I look at it, it always assumes that power projection is going to be available because it doesn't really question whether or not command is going to be 100% there or not. It doesn't assume, or it does assume that space superiority will always be present, I guess is the best way to put it. Brown water is possible because space superiority is achieved. If space superiority is questioned, the brown water operations are going to be in jeopardy or held at risk. So that's essentially, as a blue water thinker, I think that it's important that we have these, you know, assuming, you know, there's some other way of looking at this, but if you're going to have the stepping stone of roadmap to conflict or any other way that you want to visualize it, you want to have a well-balanced force presentation, a well-balanced force design to be able to meet and compete with your competitor along this spectrum of competition or the spectrum of conflict. That's really what this chart was trying to get at, and just pulling at from whatever source. So basically you can use any other graphics you want, but the point of this chart is to just say that whichever way you want to cut it, we just need to have a balanced force design. And if we focus too much on being able to crush our opposition on this upper right portion, and we don't really take the time to be able to meet them in presence and coercion, we're kind of setting ourselves up for either a self-fulfilling prophecy or failure, depending on which way you want to look at it. Because if we don't have the things that allow us to de-escalate or win at these lower levels of conflict, then we're basically always going to be ramping ourselves up because that's the only area that we can win. And that's just kind of a backwards way of looking at it. So I'm just trying to use this chart to say we need to have a balanced force design. And that's where I think blue water tends to win out, because when we say that, we mean all of government. We don't just mean have the military hardware to win in a fight. We mean we want the entire government, all of our nation, to have the deep power, to have the economic power to win at that lower level of presence and coercion, and not necessarily escalate up to force and control. That's essentially, I think, the point that you've heard, but how I, as an individual, think about that. And that's what this chart is trying to show. So what I also built to kind of drive this home, so I showed you that chart now. So now that's in the center here with what I use as these tiers to basically demonstrate how these tiers are visualized and then how these things come together. So this is how the Space Force right now exists in my Sean McClain's approach and terms, and still, still working on it. But I think this is the framework that makes sense to me as a blue water thinker for how to describe what it is that we have now versus what it is that we need later. So if you look at where these things are binned on this chart, I think we have some gaps. I think that we have a force structure right now with some core competencies that essentially don't give us the sense of the required capabilities that we need in the middle for command of space. It puts a lot of effort and weight of effort in the center, tier 3, for what I would consider to be space power projection. So it combines combat power projection, and it kind of kludges space control and space power projection into this one term, combat power projection. But I think that's dangerous, because I think you've also heard that's kind of how the Brownwater School tends to kind of get around this subject, and it says, well, that's not what we do, but we focus on the brown water, and we don't want to focus on this stuff that gets us to the brown water, so we're just going to call it this one thing. And I feel like those two terms do kind of need to be split out, because they have two different schools of thought. And I think if we put them together and try to have it be one thing, then we're not really going to solve the issue of how do we set up ourselves for success on the command spectrum in order to give our warfighters on the terrestrial front the space power projection and the information mobility, in this case, that they need. So what I propose is just normalizing, kind of like the Navy does, and just split it out. Let's just say we have tier 3. What we provide to the terrestrial warfighter, what the Brownwater School would want, is space power projection. They just want to be able to have that light switch, whatever that space effect is. That switch just stays on. They don't care they don't care what goes on behind it. They just want to have it when they have it. And that's space power projection. But what goes into that is everything in tier 1 and 2, essentially. So you've got your basics, your foundational, space domain awareness, space mobility and logistics. I also include JADC2, which General Saltzman may or may not touch on. And we have the tier 2, really what I think is the blue water way of looking at things, is all in this tier 2 command. How do we get presence or security? How do we get coercion or space smart power, the DIE model? How do we get after these other forms of things? Because we don't want to get to control. And that's really why it's an escalation thing. It's in that order. It's presence, coercion, and force in that order. With the weight of effort, you want to do the most effort up front with just presence, by just being there, having security. Then you move up and you escalate a little bit to having some form of coercion, which could include deterrence. Then if you have to, you get into control. But at the end of the day, the control, the force, is what underwrites your security and your coercion. That's essentially the function of force and control. You want to be able to win in a fight if you have to, but you want to have these other capabilities in place so that you don't necessarily need to get to that point anyway. Kind of like martial arts, right? Many martial arts codes have that same thing. You want to be trained on it, but you don't necessarily want to have to use it. Well, that's basically the same thing here. You want to have all this stuff, and you want the enemy to know that you have all this stuff, so that they understand exactly how you're going to proceed along a certain general path of COAs or whatever. This part needs to be transparent. And if we don't make enough of this transparent, then again, back to the force design, we kind of set ourselves up for this, path to failure, where we have all this stuff in our back pocket. If the enemy doesn't know about it, then they won't act the way that we want them to, because we haven't advertised that we're going to do this thing with this capability at this time. So that's why this is presented the way that I say it, which is we have to have these capabilities because it normalizes the flow of progression of any kind of competition continuum, and it takes into account the brown water requirement for space power projection, and then normalizing it again too relative to the other service functions. That's why I list it the way that I do, and that's why I think these are the functions that eventually would make sense in 2035. So I think that's the end of my slide deck. I'm happy to go back and cover over everything else.
Thank you, Major McClain. Sean, fantastic. Again, I still don't know who this guy Brian Reed is, but I'm going to read his comment. This is an excellent development of blue and brown water thinking into an integrated logical whole. Brilliant. It's not either or, but rather both and. So I'm just going to echo that. So thanks a lot, Sean. I really appreciate that. I'm going to take a few questions, and then in a few minutes, we're going to swap over to kind of a team sport where we're all on the panel. But while I've got you, just you and I for a few minutes, you know, to say that this is complicated is such a ridiculous understatement, right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, your charts are, it's complicated.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. All right. Because it is, right? Because you are incorporating the other services, you're incorporating national power in all of its dime flavors. And so to kind of try to synthesize that into a single document, you know, to be simplistic about it, that ain't easy, right? So how did you get there?
It took 2 years, so it does not, yeah, you don't get it overnight. It takes a while to do the research, look at other services doctrine, look at your own doctrine, think about it, write, research, continue to write, think about it. And then, yeah, 2-3 years later, that's what those slides are, is a product of 3 years of just thinking about what that is. And really, that was, you know, if you actually look at my thesis, that's just a chapter, but it was an important chapter that was really needed so that I could articulate from a position of a certain amount of confidence that this was why the architecture needed to be what I said it was, because it assumed the, shall we say, the values that are inherently represented by the slides that I just showed you, right? If I have a slide deck, or if I have a force structure that doesn't really take into account blue water thinking or command, well, then what's the point of an SDA architecture, right? It's back to that. If I'm not going to care about the cislunar operational area because, quote, it's not our business or it's not our job because brown water wants brown water and blue water will have to come later, well, then we're never going to get cislunar SDA. And we're never going to be able to get after commercial awareness and support of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or any other company that goes out there and does stuff. And they're going to build it themselves. And then we'll be a paying customer to that. And I'm not saying that that's not part of the architecture. I'm just saying that the focus and the way that you have that conversation, I think Brent laid it out pretty well with his conversation. It's all in how you approach and state things with your PA campaign, with your talking points, just with all these different fronts, how you go about having that conversation and how you allow the conversation to proceed and see where things go. I think that will be a very important way to go after some form of what I just said.
So this whole environment, you know, commercially, we often refer to it as the cislunar econosphere or the cislunar econozone. You know, it's a big piece of real estate, and it doesn't have, there's no common language for it, right? You know, I've been advocating to call it the McClain line. I know that you're entirely too humble to, you know, commit to that. You referred to that big circle, the green oval on one of your first charts as the green line, and pretty, you know, nondescript about it. But these things do need names. And just calling it the AOR of space doesn't really do it. So can you pull up some of your slides? I'd like to take a look at your lines of communication, some of the you know, the architecture that's up there, and you keep referencing SDA. For those folks that don't know that language, it's space domain awareness. So it's trying to understand who is doing what and where, and maybe how often, maybe all of those things. Who's doing what, where, and how often.
Can you see it?
No, not yet. And for everybody else to fully understand, I was one of many people that Sean interviewed for this report. So I definitely have a strong bias for some of the things it says. It's really smart, and we've linked it in the on the Blue Marble Week website. So feel free to go grab it. It's as he said, this is only one chapter. Well, I think this is 2 or 3 chapters, but this is only one part of a pretty damned comprehensive document. All right, so let's look at this for a second. I know that you've done this a little bit with our audience 2 months ago. I'd like you to dig a little further into it and just describe some of the things that are in some of the places.
Okay, so this is the OV1, so it has everything. It assumes that there will be an amount of economic activity. So just for fun, I came up with these icons. I do realize now that these weren't specifically named like these other ones. I thought they might be self-evident, but I said this would be agriculture, this would be power, this would be manufacturing, this brown box would be shipping, this would be mining, and this lower right would be construction. So I delineated between manufacturing and construction. I do think construction is going to be a lot larger scale. Manufacturing could just be like little widgets, other size things, but I felt that needed to be delineated. And I also thought most of that initially is going to happen in geo. You might have some of that eventually move out to the moon, but geo is going to be a big place of business in the future. So I wanted to make sure that that was represented here. I do think geo's real estate value is definitely going to go up. I think that the CLOCs, as I named them, just are going to be, if not these specific things, or really there's going to be varieties, right? This is just the general archetype, shall we say, and then you could have different subtypes with different inclinations, all having different specific functions. If you're talking from a space traffic management perspective, which is a whole other follow-on conversation to this, then that really could go after the meat of how all of these things actually work relative to each other using the laws of orbital mechanics, and how you're actually going to assign a different, shall we say, flight corridor for different types of commercial activity. All of that can feed this thing even more to say how these work relative to each other. So, you could have something over here in geo that needs to make a commercial stop over at EML1, and it's carrying one type of cargo, and then it may get refueled, and then it may shift inclination and go either to the moon or back to Earth, or some combination thereof. And it's just going to be this constant activity based on the particular characteristics of the platform in question, right? So if we use the SpaceX Starship, as the vanilla example, there's going to be a few variants, and if we have different companies, different offerings with their own compatible or incompatible, but hopefully some form of compatible, then there will be this family of systems that can feed off each other and generally contribute to this overall economic picture. And they're all just going to have their own natural place within this OV1. So that's, hopefully I answered that question and met the intent. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and I tried to keep it general, but still have a lot of content at the same time.
Right, and point out that this is 2035, right? So this is going to evolve. There's going to, we're not going to, this isn't all here, all right now, but it's not that far away. It really isn't that far away. And for the folks kind of new to some of this stuff, those red dots, those 5 red dots are the Lagrange points. And the ones that are fully circular are semi-stable Lagrange points, and the ones that are kind of long oblongs are not PowerPoint errors or Adobe Photoshop errors. They are intentionally to show that those are unstable Lagrange points. So there's so much in this chart. It's every time I see this. And then the other charts where you're describing force and presence and the continuum there is so useful. It's very useful. All right.